It's now my pleasure to welcome back to the podium Dr. Kim Belcher, who hardly needs another introduction after her wonderful keynote presentation last night. I don't know about you, but I couldn't have imagined a better way to begin our work here for the next few days that we have together. For this afternoon session, Kim will continue broadening our imagination surrounding the sacraments of initiation with a presentation entitled The Crumbs from the Children's Table, Infant Baptism, which I'm sure is a topic of particular interest to those of you who are responsible for sacramental preparation in your parishes. Please help me welcome once again Dr. Kim Belcher.
All this trust, and I've never baptized a child even once. When Hildegard was baptized, my friend Anthony said, who was baptizing her, said, "How do we do this?" And I said, "I don't know, you're the priest, you're supposed to know." And he said, "Well, I've only done it once." And I said, "Well, I haven't done it at all, so you're still on your plate." What I want to talk about today is I want to talk about how we produce a memory of infant baptism that will help us become better Christians, not only for those that are being baptized as infants in your communities, but for the whole community. That's what I think is really delightful about infant baptism, is a way that it can broaden the whole community's understanding of what it means to be a Christian. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I thought about children and memory, and what I thought of is I thought of children's books. Now, good children's books, the classics, the ones that you remember and the ones that you want to read to your own children and your own grandchildren, those are full of poetry. Even though the words often are printed on the page, they make you think it's prose, but as you read it aloud and you're turning the pages and there's a rhythm that's produced by the turning of the pages and the sounds of the words are rhythmic, and you read it hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, and that performativity and the ritual of reading together over and over again produces a kind of poetry and a kind of memorable prose that sticks with us forever, for a lifetime. So I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, how can we do this with infant baptism? How can we make infant baptism be part of our imagination as a people in the same way that, for example, Where the Wild Things Are is part of our imagination? I swear it worked when I tested it. So, Where the Wild Things Are. Max, the king of all wild things, was lonely and wanted to be where someone loved him best of all. Then all around, from far away across the world, he smelled good things to eat. So he gave up being king of where the wild things are. Max stepped into his private boat and waved goodbye and sailed back over a year and in and out of weeks and through a day and into the night of his very own room, where he found his supper waiting for him, and it was still hot. Some of you have read that more recently than others. And I thought, as Christians, we also intend to go through the place where the wild things are and return to have supper where someone loves us best of all. And so maybe we can use this to enlarge our imagination. Maybe we can use baptism as a way of understanding, repeating it over and over again as a community. Maybe we can understand where we're coming from and where we're going to. Of course, this kind of memory requires a lot of repetition, which is fine, because I bet that most of you do a lot of infant baptisms, otherwise you probably wouldn't be in this room. When I go and I give talks, especially at parishes, and they find out that I am not a cradle Catholic and that I was brought into the Catholic Church as an adult, I often hear, "You remember your baptism. I wish I remembered my baptism." I hear that a lot. I can remember my baptism. I was 9. I was baptized at North Minister Presbyterian Church in Sarasota, Florida. I remember that I thought the water in the font came from the Jordan River, based on something I had been told in the formation class. And I was surprised that it was so clear because the river water that I was used to was very brown. I knew exactly what baptism was all about. It meant that I would be a full member of the church, and that meant that I would get the grown-up envelopes like my parents did that had your full name on them, including your middle initial and your address, instead of the little pastel pink envelopes that just had a line drawing of Jesus and a child. Unfortunately, I was wrong about the envelopes. But I was right about becoming a member of the church, and I was right about the Jordan. Which is right here. Here's the Jordan River. I was right about the Jordan River, even though the water in the font came out of the tap. If you want to see the baptismal font that I was baptized in, it looked a lot like this one. So, not quite as impressive as the Jordan River. The kind of memory that serves as a foundation for our spirituality as adults is not the kind of memory that I have of my baptism precisely. It's not the memory that says, I remember that day, I remember what I was wearing, although these are all things that can be helpful as we build a spirituality that's based on baptism. But the most important kind of memory that comes from our baptism isn't that kind of memory. It's the kind of memory we build up by repetition. It's not the memory of a single event, but it's the memory of God's work and what was done in that single event for us, that we build up that memory through our experiences with other baptisms, especially. So I learned a lot more about what baptism means for myself from my son's baptism than I did from my own baptism. There's a Greek word for this, which maybe Max already taught you. I don't know. This word is anamnesis, and I like the Greek word because we really don't have an English equivalent. I'm not just teaching you a Greek word because, then you can go home knowing a Greek word. We really don't have a good English equivalent. What this word really means in Greek is memory or memorial, but what I like to define it as in English is a making of memory. Anamnesis is our way of participating in events that have happened in the past. We do this by first telling the story of the thing that's happened in the past, and then by doing a ritual action that allows us to participate in that past event. So a very good example of this is the Eucharist. When we meet for the Eucharist, we hear the story of Jesus who suffered on the cross and shared the Last Supper with his disciples. And then we eat a meal which initiates us into that suffering that he did on the cross and that meal with his disciples and the meals of the early church. Does that make sense? This is the kind of presentation where you can interrupt me for clarification. All right. If that makes sense, I'll go on. All right. So, when we use this in theology, we use it to talk about our memory of the things God has done for us. And most of the things that God has done for us are things that, in our own psychological, individual human memory, we can't remember. Not only can we not remember our baptism, many of us, but I certainly don't remember the Exodus out of Egypt. And yet, I participate in that by my participation in the liturgy every year, every week, every day if I choose. So our ability to participate in and to remember by participating in things that God has done in the past isn't limited to things that I remember, or even things that happen to me individually. We have created rituals that pass on this experience of God's salvation and God's liberation generation after generation. And you can see that happening already in the Hebrew Bible, which is why even among the Jews, we see the same kind of anamnesis, they don't use the Greek word, that we do as Christians. So I'm giving you this Greek example first because I find that a lot of times this Jewish example, a lot of times looking at someone else's rites really clarifies what we're doing in our own rites, as you probably saw me talking about last night. So this is a picture of the Seder supper. This is how the Jews memorialize the Exodus from Egypt. They have all these different foods, and they eat them in a certain order, and they have certain names, and they have particular prayers that they pray and stories that they tell over the course of an evening to relive or memorialize or make anamnesis of, make memory of the liberation that God did for them as they left Egypt. So for them, the Exodus story isn't just a text on paper, and it's not even just a story proclaimed or told from generation to generation. It is that, but it's also a story they participated in year after year by eating the right foods and telling the story together and having the people say the right things at the right time, drinking the wine. It's a lot more fun to make memory this way than it is to study flashcards. So, when you do this kind of memory, you get sometimes in Catholicism we call a sacramental imagination. So here's what happens when the work that God did in the Exodus hits the sacramental imagination of a modern day Jew. Pretty good, right? Is that what Exodus looked like? Probably not. It's better than what Exodus looked like. Exodus, when it actually happened, probably included sore feet and sore backs and, sick babies and who knows what. But this imagination, this is what we should be going for when we're looking to make baptism into the foundation of our spirituality as a community. We're looking for a community that can produce this kind of vision of the saving events that God has done for us. I'm just about to initiate the group discussion. So I'm going to start the group discussion by talking about my memories of my 3 children's baptism. Now, I already did mine, and you can see it wasn't all that impressive. My memories of my 3 children's baptism are much more developed, as you might guess. And then what I would like to do after that is I'd like to break up into small groups to talk about what makes children's baptism memorable, and then we'll talk about how to continue to make baptism more memorable and more meaningful for our communities after that. All right, so my children love to ask, what about my baptism? Tell me about my baptism. What happened at my baptism? Which is, if you have families like that in your parish, you're probably doing it right. Because that's the beginning of every good baptismal theology, is people saying, tell me about my baptism. This is my son's baptism. He was my first. And I had to pick a picture because I picked pictures of my 2 daughters. But what I find most memorable about my son's baptism is actually a song, which I didn't find a good recording of the song. But the song is, How Can I Keep From Singing? My son was baptized at a Sunday liturgy, the regular Sunday liturgy that we attended. And we didn't do anything. The regular liturgy that they had planned, the reading for that week happened to be the Epitha reading, which was amazing. But just by pure good luck, every time I hear it come around again in ordinary time, I'm just completely thrown back in memory. But what I remember the most is How Can I Keep From Singing? Because after that day, I still had the song in my head, you know how that goes. And so that night, when he was fussy, I rocked him to sleep singing the song, and it became a very important bedtime song in my family for a long time. He doesn't particularly like it anymore, but we sang it a lot when he was an infant. And what's really meaningful about that for me is the fifth verse of that song. Some of you may know, says, "The peace of Christ makes fresh my heart, a fountain ever springing." Does that sound familiar? Hopefully, didn't mess it up. And only 4 weeks after my son was baptized, he had a heart attack. And so I ended up singing that song to him in the ICU as he was struggling through the heart attack when he was on medication, he was sedated, he was intubated. and we didn't know if he was going to survive. And that verse, "The peace of Christ makes fresh my heart, a fountain ever springing," just became a real heartbeat of our time there in the hospital. It's still actually meaningful enough. I'm having a hard time not crying as I mention it to you today. So that actually is the most memorable moment. I chose this picture because it's actually just really cute. My son yawning. But that was the most memorable thing for me about his baptism, and you can see how it really became a cornerstone for our family through a very difficult time, and that's what we hope will happen with every baptism, because every family has difficult times. I don't hope any of them have heart attacks, but this is my daughter Juliana. She's named after Julian of Norwich. And what I remember most about her baptism was, well, she was actually baptized in almost an assembly line fashion. At that point, we were at a huge parish in Chicago, in the Puerto Rican section of Chicago, and they had tons and tons of infant baptisms there. And so every month they would fill up the whole church, 2 pews for every family, 1 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, and they would just go down the line. This is the funniest thing. They would go down the line. "What do you name this child?" "So-and-so, I welcome you. And I make the sign of the cross on your forehead, and I move on to the next pew to the next family." They didn't actually say that, but it was really, honestly, it was a well done baptism under the circumstances. But it was really different from the first baptism, which actually, I don't want to give the impression that the first baptism was perfect, because the priest at the first baptism was apparently under the impression that the profession of faith was optional, and he didn't do it. So, yeah. So, there is no such thing as a perfect infant baptism, at least in my experience. So, what I remember the most, though, about my daughter's baptism is that she was all happy and, sweet and having a good time, and the priest was like, "And I baptize you in the name of the Father," and she's happy, "and in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Spirit." So, that was quite interesting. Because I think the Holy Spirit just entered in and she was given the gift of tongues or something. So here's a picture of her screaming when she was baptized in the name of the Holy Spirit. This is my last baby, Hildegard, who some of you have seen around already, and I talked about her last night. The thing I remember the most about her baptism is actually before her baptism was after the Pentecost Mass at the Abbey Church at St. John's. And the Pentecost Mass totally amazed her. She was all wide-eyed and looking out here and there, and the Abbey Church at St. John's has this lovely contrast of light and dark that newborn infants are just really fascinated with, the contrast of light and dark, so she loved that. And the incense she found really fascinating. And then if you look at this picture very closely, you can see in her eyes the reflection of the stained glass at the Abbey Church. The stained glass window that goes across the back of the Abbey Church is called Sursum Corda, lift up your hearts. And she was so fascinated with that she could not fall asleep for the whole Mass. She was just completely overstimulated, which is why when Anthony went to baptize her, she screamed her head off, which I mentioned last night. It was just a little too much for a long day. But she was really amazed with the Abbey Church, and I know I'll never forget that. So, what I tell you this for is to give you a sense of what it is that parents find memorable about their children's baptisms, because maybe you don't often get this kind of feedback. My guess is you don't. But for each of my kids, I actually made a photo book of the photos from their baptism that they like to go through, and they like to ask, well, who's that? What's going on there? Who came for my baptism? Who was my godparents? Who held the candle? Who did this? Who's that? And that process of storytelling is a very powerful way of starting to build anamnesis. So I'm hoping that this will spark your memories of what's most memorable about the infant baptisms you've been to, and what are good tools that we can use to remember baptism to one another. So I'll show you the photo book. And I have the photo book linked up here, but I don't want to go through the whole thing, but I'll leave it up here in case anybody wants to take a look at the pictures during the group discussion. But now I'm going to give you about 10 minutes as a group to talk about these questions. Just a moment. All right, so here are your discussion questions on practice. I have 4 slides of discussion questions, so we'll go through them one at a time, and then I'll ask somebody from your table to share with the larger group what you talked about. So I would like, how should we do this? I suppose that none of you are going to want to come up to the podium and tell what happened at your table, but I'm at least going to make you speak to me, even if you won't be persuaded up here. So let's just start on this side of the room. Will you tell me, what were your stories about?
We all shared different methods, experiences from our parish. There was chrismation memories of older children grasping the pond, toddlers diving in the water.
That's a good one.
Description of ponds, immersion for infants, how that
Uh-huh. Good. And any tools for making memories, or do you think that stuff is all spontaneous?
Didn't get that far.
Didn't get that far. All right. Well, that's okay, because I actually knew question 2 was harder. So the next 3 slides are basically going to make you talk about question 2 a little more. So, all right. How about your table? Somebody speak for me?
Well, I shared a story about how my husband and I are part of a baptism team in our parish, and we just had 4 families, 4 babies, 3 families being baptized this past Sunday. And I've never done this before, but I just recently experienced the baptism of my first grandchild, which was a huge memorable experience, and I wanted these people who were baptizing children on Sunday to know the importance. So as the priest was gathering with the families in the back of the church, I went up in front of this assembly of people and I said, you have a job today. Your job is to document this day, to remember this day for the families, and then to call the families 1 year from today and remind them about it. So I want you to come up close to me and take pictures of all of the important moments. So got the people in the assembly to just join in.
Yeah, good for you. As you might see, I mean, photos are one of the ways that not only I remember my kids' baptisms, but one of the few ways I have of allowing them to share in that memory and really build that memory for them. Because what our kids remember of their childhood is what we've found it possible to stress for them and emphasize for them so they can remember it. So yeah, that's been really powerful for me. And we also celebrate baptismal anniversaries in my family, so my kids know the day they were baptized. They don't really probably know what it means right now, but they know the day they were baptized, and they learn it not too long after their birthday, and they'll hopefully understand what that means. Anybody else wanted to add to that at the table, or?
Yeah, I developed a trick a few years ago with the collusion of the then pastor. We always baptize at Liturgy, and the parish isn't producing babies, constantly, so we do this. We separate the rite of welcoming, which is absolutely parallel to the rite of welcoming of catechumens, from the water bath. So we do the welcoming one Sunday, and then usually 2 weeks later, we do the baptism, which we try to do by immersion and make it very celebratory. I have had a banner made that we process to the font. Of course, during the Easter season, you have the candle. We invite all the children who are in the assembly to come and sit around, hoping that they'll ask the question you asked, what happened at my baptism? We don't know what happened, but that's one of the things we're trying to do.
That's neat. Thank you.
My parish is Sacred Heart. It's the crypt over here. And
Can you speak up a little, because there's some people actually behind you, unless you want the microphone.
no, thank you.
All right, I tried.
All right. Well, we're I'm from Sacred Heart Parish. It's the crypt. It's the basement of the basilica over here. And sometimes we have baptisms at the log chapel, which is down by the lake. And it's, when you bring the whole family, it's kind of crowded. So this was kind of a special baptism, and it was my first one at the log chapel. So I had filled the water basin of the baptismal font with the water from the tap there. And after the baptism, and everybody was leaving, everybody had left, I'm cleaning up, and I have the basin full of water. And I'm trying to decide what to do with it, and I thought the only thing to do was put it in the ground. But then I saw somebody had left a quart water bottle, or a liter water bottle that they had brought.
Huh.
So I poured the water from the baptismal font, or the bowl, into the bottle. It turned out that that must be well water over there, because it did look like Jordan water. And when I went over to the house, I presented it to the family. And that was, they, were very thrilled with the fact that it was there, and they had it, and that was one of the tools that they can have. This is the memory, this is the baptismal water. And I didn't see anything liturgically wrong with it, so there you go.
Yeah, holy water. Yeah, put it in a holy, I mean, you could do that every time. Put it in a holy water bottle and give it to them in a bag. I mean,
Yeah,
that'd be really amazing. I've never even thought of that.
I didn't know what to do with it.
Right. That's neat.
So several things came up at our table, some memories of a memorable baptism, but the church was under construction. It was, the space was not very good. There was a bowl of water that was used for the baptism, but it was a good baptism. It was memorable. So it,
Yeah, it's always memorable, no matter how badly it's done, is a baptism in danger of death. So, it doesn't have to be real fancy to be memorable.
memory of a local church where at the baptism, kind of the congregation gathers in the back toward the font, and it's right below the choir loft, and seeing the kids up in the choir loft looking down over, wanting to see the action. It was another memory. Memory of how nice it is to have music at a baptism, even when it's not during Mass. In the parish where I was for a number of years, but walking around the church, the altar was in the center, but walking around the church after the baptism, carrying the newly baptized, and the congregation singing, "You are God's work of art," and watching the people interact with the baby was always a good memory. Difference between immersion, baptism, and just pouring water, something we see it differently, we experience it differently. And I think in terms of tools for making memories is inviting people, being inclusive. That was kind of mentioned over there too. Come on up. Come and gather around the font, or those. I think that's a good tool.
Yeah, and take pictures and give them to the family. That's another way of getting people involved, yeah. Is that it? All right. Next table.
Okay. We talked about a couple different aspects of memorable baptisms. Our resident priest talked about enjoying looking into the eyes of the child as he was baptizing, thinking about, the endless possibilities. How will this child grow in their call to Christ? We talked about Andrew's daughter being raised up, kind of presented to the assembly, and how she links that to the Lion King, and recognizes something of her story in the initiation of the Disney film. And I spoke of being a godparent to one of my cousins and one of my nieces. We also talked a little bit about some of the struggle, at times, some of the limitations within the liturgy, or doing baptism within the liturgy, when you get the folks who say, oh, there's a baptism today, and working to help them understand that it's not all about them, but that they're all on for remembering the baptism, on for praying for this child and supporting them. In terms of memory making, I'm anxious to compare memory books with you. Have a little catechetical memorial tool for my goddaughter, not only connecting, unpacking some of the symbols of our faith, like the origin of the white garment, but also telling the story of her white garment, which I was also baptized in, and my grandma was too. Talked a little bit about even writing letters in terms of the parents, why they wanted to have you baptized, what they hope this means for you, or godparents as well. And in terms of making memories for adults, I started doing this with some of my RCIA classes for those who are baptized, asking them to go back to their parents and have them retell the story of baptism, however far back it was, and ask their parents why they wanted them baptized. And even within the baptismal prep sessions, asking parents, what difference has your baptism made in your life? And I get a lot of blank stares because I'm not sure anybody's ever asked that before. But as they start to unpack it, even one person said, well, I went to Catholic school and I met my spouse there. So I would say my baptism had a big difference in my life, as well as, what their connection to the faith community or the values, and helping them to unpack a little bit what that means to them.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
If I could just comment on the Lion King image, and in terms of people's memories, there's several people, commented, it's like, oh, Father, I remember, I loved, when you hold the baby up like they did in Lion King, and I never did. But that was their memory. So there's something else at work here too.
Right.
Besides what actually happened.
Well, and if you think about that Passover image, the memories that stay with us are not always what the thing actually looked like. And that's just how human memory works, in a sense, but connecting baptism to this iconic moment in the movie is a totally natural thing to do. And it's the emotional memory that's happening there. So yeah, that's fascinating. And actually, I can relate to that because I was talking to a friend and I said, yeah, well, when they baptized Thomas, it was by immersion, and so we had, we were undressing him before and then dressing him afterwards. And then I went back and looked at the pictures, and he wasn't baptized by immersion, he was baptized by infusion. I don't know why I remembered it as immersion, but I did. So that was me. So our memories are faulty on details, but they're good at storytelling. And the back table.
Well, we actually shared a lot of similar stories and ideas. I think a lot of the most memorable infant baptisms we had were those baptisms where, once again, we were kind of invited into the action of what was happening. We were invited into the liturgy. I know for me it is a lot of times when children are invited into that. Our pastor is very good now, and sometimes if he's holding something, he'll give it to whatever child is standing next to him. And it's amazing to see them straighten up. Oh, I have a job now. I'm really going to pay attention. And so we kind of talked about those kinds of things. I think some of the tools and for making memories that we talked about have already been mentioned. Celebrating baptismal birthdays. I think we did talk about kind of what you were talking about, is that having children that can share with their siblings the stories too is just a really powerful thing. And as adults, being part of that conversation, I think, is important. But we mentioned technology, which you had mentioned pictures, and we mentioned there was a video of one of the baptisms, and being able to watch that was really powerful.
No, if your church has the luxury of video equipment, it seems like this would be the best time to use it, would be for an infant baptism, and then hand the DVD or whatever you create immediately to the parents. I know that's been something we've really valued in our family.
I think, like I said, everything else has also been covered. So.
All right, thank you.
Most of the things that have been touched on, we also have spoke about, but main focus is the child, is watching how the child responds during the actual baptismal rite. And one thing we talked about was the love that you can feel of those that are surrounding the child and within the church. And it is the coming together. It is the welcoming, if you will, of a new life into the church. And as far as the making memories, we talked about similar things, about it's just sharing, making it feel like it's a special day for the child. I personally have my own little baptismal outfit. My mother put it on a doll for me, which I still have, and pictures. And of course, nowadays, there's just so many more ways to, commemorate the special day.
I think some of our things are similar and some are different. She was sharing about in their parish, because of the largeness of it, that they're doing 10 and 15 baptisms, but kind of like a cattle call on a Saturday, rather than more sacramental and having the whole congregation, experiencing it at the weekend mass. And then Father said that he has parishioners, like the people that are named as the godparents, to write a prayer about the baby, and then maybe say that prayer during the liturgy for that child. So that was a neat idea, we thought, to make a memory. Some of us, help plan the liturgies for the baptisms, and so there's certain things about that we enjoy. And you had said something, there was something you said and you said. And then she remembers having her own, she said, I'm not Catholic. I said, well, that doesn't matter. She remembered, baptismal, your baptismal experience about having their own dress, or the feel of it and the touch of it and all.
Yeah, I was saying that the church gave, I don't know if every church does this, my church gave me a white leather Bible that had a olive leaf from the Mount of Olives in it. And I remember I had that for a long time as a kid in my drawer. And I remember even before I could read, but the way it touched, and it was like a physical object that I had as, a 6-year-old, and it was my Bible, so.
All right, great. Anybody need a comment before we move on to the next? Yeah.
This just came to me as I was listening. There was a family in the parish who had 2 sons and 2 daughters. They moved away, didn't see them anymore, and they grew up. One of the boys was a classmate of one of my nephews, and he seems never to have found himself. His mother called us, the community, one day and said that he had committed suicide, and nobody found him for weeks. So she was dealing with that in one state, his body was in the 3rd state, and she wanted to have a service at our place because her husband was buried in our area. So she came bringing her son's baptismal candle and his baptismal garment. And he had been cremated. And I know this is verboten, but when it was time to put the cloth on the body, she brought his baptismal garment and laid it on top of the box of cremains and lighted his baptismal candle from the paschal candle, which was there. that was one of the most powerful moments for me of the connection between dying with Christ and living with Christ. And I'll never forget it.
Wow, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing.
I can't believe that's verboten. Does anybody
That's
here?
what I heard.
That cremation is verboten?
No.
That putting
Any
The white
of
garment?
the ritual symbols with the cremains.
We, in our parish, we have a little now, or,
yeah, I don't think it is anymore.
Praise God.
Yeah, it used to be that they, but now they think that that if you have the body there in any form, it's much better to ritualize with it than without it, if that makes sense. That's my understanding. If you read the more recent literature, yeah. So hopefully that'll ease any remaining qualms of your conscience. So, all right. Shall we move on?
One comment that was shared at the table, that we spend a lot of time, a lot of parishes spend a lot of time preparing families for baptism, and after the big day, then most of us just don't see them again.
Yeah.
So I think we need to kind of, in some sense, come up with a mystagogical way of bringing the families back for some type of, follow-up sessions to keep them, and many of them, I know in my experience, the parents are not practicing Catholics, so we're hoping that this is some type of catharsis that helps them understand how important it is for them to continue that life experience, not only for their child, but for themselves as well.
I'm glad you said that, and I knew someone would say it. And I will say that most new parents, especially in the culture, the state of American culture today, many new parents, as I did, live a long way from their families and perhaps a long way from most of their close friends, and would probably be very open to any social overtures by the church. And I feel like that's a missed opportunity in a lot of places, where that would be a really good time to reach out and say, come, we have childcare, we have dinner, come talk to other parents that are new about, what's happened to you in the last 3 months. And that's probably as good of building a baptismal community as you can do with the culture the way it currently is. So I think if there are any resources to devote to that, it's a good place to devote a few resources. So I agree with that altogether.
I think building the tools with that would be that they all have pictures. So it would be wonderful for them to bring, their experience to those other families and share them with one another.
Right, and if you are a parish that can do recordings, you can say, come, we have DVDs of your kid's baptism, and, I don't know, in some places there's still a scrapbooking craze, which is actually something that strikes terror into my heart. I'm not a scrapbooker at all. But, we have photos of the inside of the church that you can use for scrapbooks, or we have, paper or whatever. That would be another way of getting people working with those memories and talking about what they are and what they mean. You can't interpret something that you don't talk about. All right. And that brings me to my next question, which is, how do we go about interpreting? And I don't mean how do you interpret infant baptism, because that's really not crucial here. What I mean is, how do we make it possible for our families to interpret baptism for one another? There are, believe me, a near infinite number of perfectly good theologies about baptism. They're not mutually exclusive, right? The church has evolved thousands of explanations for what God is doing in baptism, many of which are very good. As I know in the morning presentations, you're hearing about 4 of the big ones. But there are literally thousands of smaller ones. And so one of the things that we need to do is we need to give people, I know that many times we're working with people that don't have well-developed spiritual imaginations in the first place. They might not know the scriptures that they would need to know to interpret this ritual in the ways that, for example, Max was talking about this morning. So that's where we need to start, is giving people a foundation for interpreting what's happened to them. For example, I know, in the memories that I was giving you and in the memories that we were sharing at the tables, we already have a lot of theologies embedded. So, for example, the funeral. The fact that this is dying and living with Christ, that's something that's already got a theology embedded, or an interpretation, a way of understanding what's happening embedded. If people don't come back, a lot of times it's because they don't have a meaning. As you were saying, I don't know your name. Christina was saying, she asked them, what difference has your baptism made for you? And they don't know what to say in reply. And a lot of times it's because we have, in a sense, taken a break in some family, for example, from talking about baptism and what it might mean. I wanted to give you kind of a new one. The title of this talk, The Crumbs from the Children's Table, comes for me from an interpretation that I have about baptism. It's actually closely related to, I think, what Andy's going to talk about tomorrow afternoon, where we need to think of our infants who are being baptized as the ones that are giving us the gift. And I think that actually comes very naturally for infant baptism to most of us. Most of us feel like our children are gifts, not something we've earned. It's one of the few times in your life that you feel like they can make endless demands on you and you're not sorry. And so it does wear off after a time, though, doesn't it? I think of our experiences of baptism at other people's baptism in the light of this story in the Gospels about Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman. So the Syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus and says, "Come and heal my daughter. She's very ill." And Jesus says to her, "I was sent only to the Jews of the house of Israel." In other words, you're not my problem, right? Which, maybe it doesn't, we don't like to think about Jesus saying this, but this is what he says. And the Syrophoenician woman says to him, "Lord, even the dogs eat the crumbs from the children's table." And she says, "Go in peace, your child will be well because of your great faith." So this is, to me, we are receiving undeserved gifts from these baptisms. And so this is the theology that I started with thinking about this, but I just wanted to give it as an example of one of the ways we can think about baptism that might help people understand what baptism is doing for them. So I want you to think about, I don't want you to think right now about baptismal prep, because I have a separate period where we're going to talk about that. I want now for you to think about what you do at baptism and after baptism in your communities that might help people form an understanding of what baptism does. All right? All right. Oh, I forgot the second question, or I forgot to introduce the second question. The second question is about the ties between ordinary life and what you do at your baptism. So, for example, one of the things that I think is helpful for people remembering baptism on a regular basis is something like having a baptismal anniversary, that you do something that's memorable in the family that then gives a reason to talk about baptism. Similarly, if you think about the child's baptism every time you bathe your child, then obviously you're going to be remembering baptism quite frequently. So that's the kind of thing that I want you to think about for the second question. I am not going to have time to have you go around and share by table, so I'm going to sum a couple things I heard that were, I thought, good ideas. So definitely I heard echoed the concern that people might not have the biblical imagery to make the connections. So, for example, I heard in one table an idea of doing a baptismal memorial. I'm not exactly sure what I was drifting from table to table, but near the Easter Vigil to connect it with that great liturgical year symbol of baptism, so that even those who are baptized as infants are able to sort of take on those images that come at the Easter Vigil. And also using the church architecture to spark a memory of, and here's it was a stained glass window, right, that had an image of baptism or a baptism of our Lord maybe. It would be a great way of being able, and then those people always have that window to keep reminding them of what it is that what they understand about baptism, and that gives a chance for their understanding of baptism to continue to grow. I also heard an idea of having the baptismal service happen on a Sunday when there was a pancake breakfast, and giving the family tickets to the pancake breakfast, which is actually a really great idea, because that's one of the most effective ways to get people to come back. If they actually manage to connect with somebody personally at the pancake breakfast, they will come back. So that's definitely, and it's also a good way to get the rest of the community involved in what has happened. I heard about a priest who does a very good job tying the scripture of the day in with the theme of baptism, and even will introduce the idea, I actually heard this at several tables, introduce the idea that there's going to be a baptism before the gospel's read, so that baptism is already an image that allows people to understand the gospel of the day. And she said wonderingly, he always seems to find some connection to baptism. And I thought, that's good. Everybody should be able to. There always is one. So that is also a great idea. I'm trying to remember some of the other things I heard. Anybody else have one very good insight that they think everybody should do? Oh, I heard there's a group that actually does mystagogy. The week after, they gather together and they talk about what happened in the baptism, and they share their memories of the baptism. So that's another really good way to do it. A way that is a kind of low resource way, because I know all these things take your time. I really do. So any other things to add? We don't have a lot of time left, so.
I didn't have time to say this at the table, but I was gonna. I do a baptism preparation where I use the things of baptism. And I ask people to write down things on large pieces of paper underneath the things. An association that they have with that white garment, or with water, or with a candle, or fire, or a whole bunch of oil. Something that has nothing to do with God at all. So they're forced to imagine the connection of the ritual symbols with real life. That's one piece. Then the second piece, after we've done that, I have scripture texts, texts from the blessings for oil and some of the other things, and texts out of the baptismal rite that I just made like a phrase. And I asked somebody to read it so that they are beginning to make the connections between what the church says about all these things and the scriptures and the stuff that they have just interacted with. So I never have enough time to really talk about that with them, because it's always like 10 minutes left. But at least I think it opens up some possibilities.
All right, and do you do that in baptismal prep?
Yes.
Well then, thank you. You just introduced the next set of questions. Well done. And that means I don't have to. That sounds like a great way to use your baptismal prep time. This is the slide where we're going to talk about baptismal preparation, and I think this will probably be our last one. So I'm actually going to go ahead and I'll show you both slides, and you can decide what you want to talk about. How's that? So the first question or set of questions is, how do we better use baptismal prep to form memorable baptismal experiences and to give people the tools for interpretation? So in other words, now that we've talked about all those things that we think are helpful to creating baptismal memories and baptismal stories and interpretations of those stories, how do we use prep time to better equip people for that work that we're asking them to do? All right, and the next question, which is just as important. How can we use our baptismal spirituality to enrich the life of our whole community. So in other words, I would also like to think about, and you might not have time to talk about it, but think about as you leave at least, how can I use this to change our religious formation program? I don't mean necessarily change it, but how can we enrich our religious formation program? How can we enrich our marriage prep? How can we enrich our youth group? How can we enrich these other aspects of our parish adult faith formation with the use of these tools that we're developing here? All right, so I will let you choose which slide you want to talk about. Do we want to split up by table by which slide you'd prefer to talk about? How many people want to talk about the third slide? The one I did before, the questions about preparation. How many people don't want to give me an answer? All right, I'll turn you loose. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So, I want to conclude by thanking you all for coming and for sharing your insights and your great experience. I really learned a lot from being here, so thank you very much. And I also want to encourage you all to keep continuing to do what you're doing. You guys, I can tell from your discussion, you're all doing a wonderful job and you're really committed to your work. And I hope you have a really great year doing that work.